How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of my little nerd show. Okay, so this time I thought I would do GM tips. 6 tweaks to make for better, cooler bosses, right? Whenever you have a boss, you want it to be a memorable encounter. You want it to definitely be not a pushover, right? You don't want to fight for like 3 rounds and then your great boss villain just croaks, right? It's got to be memorable. It's got to be cool. So here's 6 things to keep in mind when you make them to make them a little different, or make it a little more fun. So first off, every boss has to have more hit points, right? You want a beefy boss that can take some damage. There's a lot of stat blocks, and whether you play Pathfinder or D&D or any of them, where really kind of cool monsters really don't have a lot of hit points, or maybe they seem like they have a lot of hit points, but when you're up against even a couple of level 10 adventurers can blaze through 150 hit points real quick, like a round or two. So you want your boss to have enough meatiness to them so that they can endure at least a few rounds, right? So at least I think especially like a campaign ending boss should have at least 5 or 6 rounds to that boss. Like otherwise it's just another kind of crap encounter. And always keep in mind that your PCs, especially as they level, can dish out a pretty impressive amount of damage usually, especially when they just kind of unload and use all their good abilities. Now, another thing to sort of keep in mind is sort of part of making a boss meatier is giving them some endurance in terms of hit points. This can be extra hit points, but it can also be like innovative ways for them to heal themselves. But what you don't want to do is ever have the boss stop to heal themselves, because that's just going to be a wasted turn. Unless it's like a full heal, it's generally a wasted turn for the boss. They should never have to stop to heal themselves. Have somebody else heal them. Given them a passive healing ability somehow, like they're regenerating. Maybe they run into something cool. Like they run into a power supply crystal and they run and grab it and they get healed or something. But don't just have them stop and heal themselves. But they definitely need to be meatier, right? This should be kind of very basic, right? Bosses should have bonus hit points. Next, actions. Now, this is something that I tweak on my end. What I basically do is give bosses multiple initiatives, usually 2, right? Any kind of really cool dungeon ending boss or campaign boss is always going to have more than 1 initiative, right? They're going to go twice around, sometimes 3. It just kind of depends on how I tweak it. But sometimes they call this action economy, but just give them multiple initiatives, multiple go-arounds. This adds a big dimension and sort of levels things out. I mean, even pit fiends go once per turn, right? I mean, it's hard to compete against 5, sometimes 6 characters taking 6 turns against your boss's 1. So definitely try something new there. I recommend the multiple initiative, right? And essentially what I basically do is I roll 2 initiatives, generally staggered out by about 10. So if the first initiative is 20, then the next one's at 10. So the boss goes twice, right? This really beefs up an encounter, especially when she starts stacking the extra hit points. You also kind of might consider making alternating attack types, right? As part of their one round they attack you with their weapon, or rather 1 action they attack you with their weapon. On their next initiative, they do something else. Sometimes you can use like a layer action if you're playing D&D, but you can also do an AOE damage. Maybe it's just at the end of the round, the boss just lets out a burst of negative energy, right? Or maybe there's a bunch of minions and the boss lets out a burst of healing energy. Something like that, right? You can mix up the action so it's not just attack and then attack again. Maybe they buff themselves. Maybe it's a recurring buff. Maybe it's some kind of defensive action. Maybe it's a multi-target ability, just something like that. Alternate the attack types, have them do multiple different types of attacks every turn. So next is sort of passive damage, damage over time abilities. These are pretty useful for bosses. This is another thing you can do. You can give them like a cold aura that does damage, persistent damage constantly, right? Oh, whiskey. You can give them a cold aura, something that's just persistently doing damage. Maybe it just does, 5 or 6 points of damage every turn, which, begins to add up if the fight goes on long, right? I've done what I call a necrotic aura, where it just does like half, it minimizes the amount of healing that players can do. Like it cuts their healing ability in half, something that gives them, it's something that the boss does to them, but it's not an active thing that they're doing, right? The boss just has that ability and it's passive. So it's something that the boss is doing without having to sort of burn up an action. Now, the other thing you can do is, I haven't done this in a while, but I used to, kind of inspired from warlocks from World of Warcraft, was to put a damage over time curse on somebody, where like, the demon looks at the PC menacingly, utters some crazy infernal words, and all of a sudden a rune appears on that PC's head, and he starts bleeding out his eyes and losing 2 points of con every turn. And that just happens, right? Every turn that player is going to lose 2 points of con, right? And it's one of those things that gets the PCs to be like, oh, what the hell's going on, right? And it's something that just persists, right? The boss does it once and that's it, right? It just keeps doing damage over time, and the boss doesn't have to exert any more actions to do it, right? So passive damage, passive abilities. Another one, you can have your boss, one interesting thing you could do is have your boss get stronger as the fight goes on, right? It starts off at a certain level, but as it fights and as it takes damage, it goes into like a frenzy, it gets stronger, like Saiyans do, right? Like Goku does. Saiyans get stronger through the fight. Have your boss do that. That's another interesting dynamic that you can sort of throw in, that's sort of not quite a damage over time, but like a buff over time, right? They don't have to expend something to do it. It just happens, right? So on that note of damages, your boss should do some AOE damage, right? Really good bosses, depending on the level, right? Second level bosses probably don't need to be doing lots of AOE damage, but 7, 8, 10, 12 definitely should be attacking the party as a whole, right? Not just zeroing in on one character, because you kind of, as a DM, that the monster should just attack the healer, right? But you rarely do that because it just seems mean. But you can do damage over time, or rather AOE damage. This is area of effect damage. The boss should always have some kind of burst AOE damage, right? But fireballs, chain lightning, invent some. Invent like a self-centered fire wave, right? It's basically a fireball centered on the boss that just hits everything around it for fire. Maybe it occasionally charges up its weapon and hits somebody, and a chain lightning breaks out there. Anything that hits multiple targets, that sort of increases the sort of economy of action that the boss has, you want to do that. This helps a lot. This makes it a more, we'll say, a more engaging encounter, right? It's not just one guy. The boss isn't just hitting on whoever your best fighter is. He's going to be hitting everybody at the same time. Keeps your healer on your toes, keeps everybody kind of in the mix. So this is just an easy thing that almost all bosses should do, right? Well, depending on the level. Like once you get into really over 6th or 7th level, you want all your boss to have something that'll hit multiple party members, right? This kind of adds to the challenge and makes it a little more memorable. So 5, and stealing a page out of every JRPG ever, final boss, have multiple forms. Have your boss do that. This is super fun. right? This is something that video games have done for a long, long time, especially RPGs, is that, you get to the final boss, you kill him, and then the guy lays down, and then he goes, "Brah," and he turns into a monster, right? And you fight the real final boss, right? This is super fun to do in campaigns because they don't expect it generally. I mean, if you do it all the time, then they kind of know your trick, right? But even then, even when they know it's going to kind of happen, it's still fun, right? They're like, okay, now what? Give it a third form. So now every time they fight a boss, they're just kind of like waiting, what's going to happen now? This is a super easy, super fun mechanic. It's always a big hit. I'm just saying, it's always fun depending on how you work it in. And you can be creative. Give an example I did for one dungeon a while back, quite a while back. I had them fight a Naga, right? There was a Naga in a room that was kind of beefed up and was flinging spells at him. And at the center of the room, there was the treasure was held by a glass statue, right? This thing they wanted. Once the Naga died, they went in to try to retrieve it, and they noticed that all the blood from the Naga was flowing to that statue, and the blood eventually flowed up around the glass statue. The glass became mobile and red, and I called it a blood golem. And then this crazy thing jumps down and starts attacking them, right? It's even tougher than the Naga was. And they loved it. They're like, that's awesome, right? They're just like, what the hell is that, right? This also goes back to like making your own monsters. So the boss encounter has these sort of phases to where you're kind of mixing it up, right? It makes it much more memorable and much more, we'll say, dynamic and just kind of fun, just generally fun. So keep that in mind. JRPGs have been doing it forever because it works. It's totally fun. Lastly, minions, right? Not just normal, fighter types, a minotaur surrounded by goblins. Make the minions interesting in some way, particular to this encounter. They should interact with the boss in some special way. Maybe one of the boss's actions every turn buffs one of those minions ridiculously, right? And that minion comes at you, and it's like a super minion. Maybe the boss have done this one. Maybe the boss will occasionally consume one of the minions to heal itself, right? And then you give the players that added dynamic of, do we go after the boss or do we need to kill the minions first? Generally, they depending on how the minions are, but a lot of times they try to burn down the main guy first. This incentivizes them, they'll do that for a turn or two and then realize, oh no, we got to kill the minions first, right? And so you're kind of throwing them a monkey wrench in the middle of battle that they figure out. And players love to feel like they figured something out. You can have a feature where the boss is dependent on the minions. Say if there's 6 minions, every time you kill a minion, the boss gets a little bit weaker, or conversely, right? Every time you kill one of the minions, the boss gets stronger, right? Anything like that, any kind of interesting interaction with the minions makes it a much more interesting, sort of unique encounter with bosses. This is easy to do with undead. You have some big undead in the middle that will consume the other undead, or maybe consume the ghouls around it, or wraith or something, right? Or maybe consume one to launch an attack. There's a lot of ways you can go with that, but it adds another dimension, right? And it keeps it kind of fun and interesting. So that's another quick video, 6 little things you can do with bosses. Hope you enjoyed that. Hope you put that to good effect. And I will see you next time. Take it easy, y'all.